I've been asked to comment on the Summit for Democracy being held this week. I am a US citizen and a democratic ideologue. That is, my ideology is democracy. I'm a believer that the best system for organizing ourselves politically is democracy. The word coming from the Greek demos for people and kratia for power. In other words, the people rule, or all of the people have an equal share of political power. If political power were concentrated in the hands of only some of the people, it would be oligarchy, some rule. And if the few who rule are the rich, it would be plutocracy, wealth power. So to me, the idea of a summit for democracy is excellent. Likewise, the idea of holding a summit for avoiding catastrophic climate change seems to me also excellent. But not if all attendees of such a summit arrived via private jet, drove individually from the airport to the conference center in SUVs, and the summit was sponsored by Exxon and Shell. And that is much the same problem with the current Summit for Democracy. It's taken me most of my lifetime and nearly all of my time professionally as a political psychologist to figure out the thinking of those who lead the US. Now, you can call them the ruling class or the political establishment, but I prefer a former Obama speechwriter's term, particularly for the foreign policy establishment, that is, the blob. So I can only imagine that this question, what is the blob thinking, is quite a mystery for people from other countries. Because on the one hand, you have the lofty rhetoric from US leaders about the ideals of democracy and human rights, and the moral imperative of implementing these ideals. But on the other hand, you have the historical record of US government support for allied dictatorships, violations of international law, meddling in other countries' elections, supporting and co-organizing coups against elected leaders, and so on. How to explain this glaring discrepancy? If I were viewing this from abroad, the explanation that would appear most likely in my mind would be that all the talk about democracy and human rights is pure cynicism, that US leaders know full well that they are creating a smokescreen to hide their true goal, which is maximizing power at all costs. This theory, the cynical theory in other words, is that the idealistic rhetoric about democracy is just a stick used to beat governments that don't play ball with the empire. That is, they don't follow orders. Now, I think that theory has some truth to it, but it only applies to the small fraction of US government officials who actually know the dark side of US foreign policy history. For the majority, George Orwell's line applies perfectly. Quote, "The nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but he has a remarkable capacity for never even hearing about them in the first place." Unquote. So most people in the US, including politicians, have at best a faint idea of the extent of anti-democratic interventions their government has imposed around the world. And even for the informed few, this theory is psychologically inaccurate. Consider this from former President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Leslie Gelb, in his book, Power Rules. Quote, "I actually believe that America does have good ideals, far nobler than those found in most countries. But like any great power, America has worldwide responsibilities that conflict with its ideals. A Chinese diplomat recently berated me about just such US double standards. I replied, 'We don't have double standards, we have quadruple standards. It's the fate of every great power, as you yourselves must see.'" Unquote. So in other words, yes, US foreign policy is hypocritical, and the US government applies double or quadruple standards to countries. You've got one standard for subordinate allies in which democracy is nice, but largely irrelevant, and another standard for countries that fail to subordinate their policies to Washington's diktat. But in their minds, this isn't the vice of hypocrisy, it's a virtue. Because in their ideology, any other potential hegemon would not be as beneficent as the US. Hence, the United States' primary responsibility is maintaining its hegemony, even if that requires sacrificing secondary ideals like democracy and human rights. In psychological terms, this is a means of cognitive dissonance reduction. That is, an attempt to paper over the dissonance-causing discrepancy between the ideals of human rights and democracy and the actual practice of US foreign policy, which is animated by power maximization über alles, that is, above all other considerations. Perry Anderson, in his book American Foreign Policy and Its Thinkers, located the essence of the US government's role as leader of the free world during the Cold War. He wrote, quote, "Monarchs, police chiefs, generals, sheikhs, gangsters, latifundists, all were better than communists. Democracy was certainly the ideal political system. Where it was firmly established in the advanced industrial countries, markets were deepest and business was safest. But where it was not, in less developed societies, matters were otherwise. There, if elections were not proof against attempts on private property, they were dispensable. The free world was compatible with dictatorship. The freedom that defined it was not the liberty of citizens, but of capital, the one common denominator of its rich and poor, independent and colonial, temperate and tropical regions alike. What was incompatible with it was not absence of parliaments or rights of assembly, but abrogation of private ownership of the means of production." Unquote. Or, put another way, in the lyrics of Immortal Technique's song The Third World, where he says, "I'm from where the only place democracy is acceptable is if America's candidate is electable." Unquote. Nothing significant has changed since. The blob, that is, the US foreign policy establishment, has coalesced around a new the enemy to replace first the USSR and then global terrorism in the first part of the 21st century. That new the enemy is China, or as Donald Trump would say, China. Now, this is a monumental mistake. It's dangerous not only for China and the US, but for everyone on this planet, because the US, along with every other country on Earth, faces only two truly existential threats: nuclear weapons and the ecological crisis, of which climate change is a large part. The IPCC recently released the final installment of their sixth assessment report, which issued a clear warning that governments must act immediately to transform the global economic system or risk catastrophe. As the UN Secretary General put it, quote, "Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once," unquote. This is why the US government's seeming eagerness to start a new Cold War is so threatening. As we would say back in the US, ain't nobody got time for this bullshit. We don't have time for a new Cold War. We don't even have time for hostile US-China relations. At the very minimum, we need an unprecedented degree of cooperation between China, the US, and the EU to transform the global economy for long-term sustainability. And we know what needs to be done. Massive investments in renewable energy, stranding existing fossil fuel assets, electrifying everything that can be electrified, and using green hydrogen or other renewable energy sources for anything else. And we have precedents. During World War II, the US rapidly transformed its entire economic system for military production. And right now, China has made more public investment in renewable energy than any other country. But more is needed, especially in cooperation. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Now, in the West, it is a common, if mistaken, belief that the Chinese word for crisis, weiji, comprises two characters, meaning danger and opportunity. Now, that might not be true as a matter of linguistics, but it certainly is true applied to the present moment. There is opportunity in the present danger, the ecological crisis. Since the US and EU have largely abdicated leadership, other than rhetorical leadership, on the ecological crisis, there is an opportunity for China to take the lead by redoubling, tripling, quadrupling its investments in renewable energy. And in that scenario, it would be hard for the blob to demonize China, when it is busy building the economy of the future, an ecological civilization that is an economy running on renewable energy and designed to be indefinitely sustainable. So, in conclusion, I would advise forgetting entirely about this shambolic summit for democracy and focusing attention instead on the summit we desperately need, a summit of all the world's countries to make human civilization sustainable long-term. And if China takes a wider lead on averting ecological catastrophe, I predict that by mid-century, this new Cold War talk will be remembered only by the most specialized historians of the 2010s and 2020s. Thank you for your time.